Hello students, I want to discuss with you today Chapter 2, Education for All. In 1994, the Salamanca Statement was created. It had the support, it was issued by the United Nations, and it had the support of 92 countries. The Salamanca Statement affirms the following points. Every child has unique characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. Education systems should be designed and educational programs should be implemented to take into account the wide diversity of characteristics and needs of all children. Those children with special educational needs must have access to regular general education, and schools should also accommodate these children within a child-centered instructional program. Regular schools with this inclusive orientation are the most effective means of combating discriminatory attitudes, creating welcoming communities, and building an inclusive society, as well as achieving education for all. Education for all also indicates that regardless of the race, the cultural backgrounds, the socioeconomic status, the physical disability, or the intellectual changes, students must be educated fairly. In 1975, it was finally put into practice for all students with disabilities to be educated appropriately and fairly. All children have the right to education. There were major court cases and federal legislation focusing on the rights of education for students or individuals with disabilities. The court case Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954 established that segregation of students by race is held unconstitutional. Education is a right that must be available to all on equal terms. There was the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This revealed that Pennsylvania schools must provide a free public education to all school-aged children with mental retardation. And then there was the Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia in 1972. The exclusion of individuals with disabilities from free and appropriate public education is a violation of the due process and equal protection clauses according to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Public schools in the District of Columbia must provide free education to all children with disabilities, regardless of their functional level or regardless of their ability to adapt to the present educational system. We continue on, and you can see and you can read these for yourself. I want to point out one more, and then I'll let you go back and read the rest of these for yourself. But look at the third one down. Board of Education of the Hendrick Hudson School District versus Rowley. The U.S. Supreme Court held that in order for special education and related services to be appropriate, they must be reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive education benefits. So students with disabilities have to receive fair and free education, and they must also receive the benefits required for their appropriate education. Public Law 99 through 457 points out just a few pieces, and this is also found in your textbook. But in 1986, Congress made an amendment to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. We see that it extended all rights and protections of school-age children who are ages 6 through 21. And, okay, that's not all. And to preschoolers ages 3 through 5. The PL 99-457 also established a program for infants and toddlers up through 2 years old. So technically, according to the Public Law 99 through 457, infants to 2 years old, toddlers, infants, preschoolers ages 3 to 5, and then all student ages 6 through 21. So you can see accommodations have to be made. Infants and toddlers with developmental delays became eligible for services that included multidisciplinary assessment and an individualized family service plan. This is the IFSP. I do know for a fact my mother was an educator till she retired, and she worked with a school district. She was the gifted and talented coordinator for their district, but she lives in Alma, Arkansas, near Fort Smith, and she worked with a school district that would take infants and toddlers and preschool age children. They would go to this special school. They would have to be tested, and if they were found developmentally challenged in any way, maybe they had a low birth rate, weight, or any kind of abnormal showing on the test that they were given, they could be speech delayed. It didn't matter. So almost every child could somehow fit into that category and could receive free education from infancy all the way through preschool, and then they move into the K through 12, and of course then the school districts have to pick up. So Public Law 99-457 just looks out for every child from infancy basically through the age of 21. Individuals with Disabilities Act in 1986, this is the one that Congress amended for the Handicapped Children Act to create free and appropriate public education. And as I just said, it included preschool age children, it included infants, toddlers ages 6 through 21. Well, the ages 6 through 21 was already in place, but in 1986 it was extended. Special education, what does it mean? It means specifically designed instruction that is provided at no cost to the parents in all settings. Free and appropriate public education is the term that is used to refer to this. It's also known as FAPE. When teachers provide interventions in the regular classroom and students are not making progress, the following steps must be taken. An instructor must initiate a referral. Now, a parent can also make that referral. You must conduct a multidisciplinary assessment of that child. You must identify the student as having a disability. You must determine the student's criterion of being eligible for specialized instruction. The non-discriminatory and multidisciplinary assessment involves IDEA, which incorporated several provisions related to the use of non-discriminatory testing procedures in labeling and placing students. Okay, so you have to label the student in order to place the student in the proper format to receive the assistance and the proper tools for education. But you also have to be non-discriminatory in doing so. Testing of the students must be done in their native or their primary language whenever possible. You need to always try to find a way to make that possible. The use of the evaluation procedures selected and administered are to prevent cultural or racial discrimination. Again, cannot discriminate regardless. They may have a language barrier that puts them in this disability category. So even if they do, you have to be very careful that you're not discriminating against them. Validation of the assessment tools is necessary for the purpose for which these assessments are being used. So make sure that you are using valid assessments for the purpose that you're saying you're using them for. The assessment by a team of school professionals using several pieces of information to formulate a placement decision. Okay, so you have to have a whole team of school professionals, and we include the teachers, the classroom teachers, the resource teachers, sometimes even the special ed teachers. If a speech therapist is involved because of a language barrier, you just have to have a makeup of a whole professional team from the school to do these assessments and then to evaluate and discuss these assessments. Parents have rights according to IDEA. They have to give consent in writing before the child is initially assessed to determine the eligibility for special education and related services. If the parent will not consent in writing, the child cannot be tested. The parent has the right to give consent in writing as the educational setting in which the child will receive special education and related services. So the parent has to agree to the services as well as the location in which those services will be rendered. The parent has the right to request an independent educational assessment if the parents believe that the school's assessment is inappropriate. If a parent disagrees, the parent can force the school to find another means of assessment independent from the school district. Parents also have the right to request an educational assessment at the public expense if the parent disagrees with the school's assessment and recommendations. Again, the parents will not pay for the services nor the assessments. If assessments are done and the parents disagree, they can force more assessments to be done at the expense typically of the school district or the state. Parents have the right to participate on the committee that considers the assessment of, the placement of, and the programming for the child. Parents have to be completely on board and completely involved. Parents also have the right to inspect and review educational records and even challenge the information if they believe this information is inaccurate, if the information is misleading, or if it's in violation of the privacy or other rights of the child. Parents have the right to request a copy of information from the child's educational record. Parents have the right to request a due process hearing concerning the child or the school's proposal or the refusal to initiate or change the identification, educational assessment, or placement of the child, or the provision of a free and appropriate public education. So you can see parents have a great deal of rights according to IDEA. It's going to be advantageous for you to know the parents' rights as you become a classroom teacher, because you could accidentally violate one of these and the parents could sue you very, very quickly. An IEP is something that you're going to be working with this year in your field study project. IEP stands for the Individualized Education Program. An IEP is a written statement which is used as the framework for delivering a free and appropriate public education to every eligible student with a disability. Parents and professionals join together in developing the IEP based on the student's needs. The IEP must include various assessment results. It must be used daily and reviewed annually. And again, you bring together that professional team along with the parents when every time the IEP is reviewed and updated. It has to be updated yearly, annually. An IEP must also include a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and the child's functional performance, how the disability affects the child's involvement and progress, and how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. The IEP must also include a statement of measurable annual goals, such as academic and functional, designed to meet the child's needs that result from the disability and enable the child to make progress. The IEP description must include a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals is described and how it will be measured and when periodic reports will be provided. Parents have to get updated reports periodically, and that must be recorded on the IEP. It must also include a statement of special education and related services and supplementary aids and services that are going to be provided to the child. And it must state modifications will be provided to A, advance toward goals, B, be involved in and make progress, C, be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and non-disabled children. The most commonly pushed format of education for a child with disabilities is education in the least restrictive environment. And there is this chart that breaks it down and goes over and discusses the level going from top to bottom. The very least is the child is placed in the general classroom with no additional or specialized assistance. And then he's placed in the general classroom. The special ed teacher comes in and plays a conclusive role in assisting the classroom teacher in accommodating and working with that child in the classroom. And you can see it goes on down from there. So, of course, the least restrictive is he's just functioning in the main classroom. There may be some accommodations made that the classroom teacher, she handles that privately, quietly, and it's all well and good. And then it goes all the way down, the next level to where the resource teacher will come in and make some special accommodations to that child at various points in the day. And then this goes all the way down to the student is educated through homebound or hospital instructional programs. So you can see it begins to narrow down as far as the child being in the least restrictive environment. So the greatest capacity is having the child in the classroom, having some accommodations, but the classroom teacher handles it. All the way down to the severely disabled child is not even able to go into the classroom, but the teacher still has to find ways to provide a means of educating that child. When a child has been reported or suggested that there may be some disabilities requiring special services and accommodations being made, the school district has 4 phases that it must follow. And phase 1 is initiating the referral. The school personnel or the parents indicate the concern. They make the request. If the referral is made by the school, then the parents are notified of the concerns. The child study team that we mentioned just a moment ago, which may be comprised of several different teachers, especially if a child is old enough to change classes and have different teachers throughout the day. If not, if he's in the elementary, they may bring in the music teacher, the art teacher, the PE teacher, the classroom teacher, the school counselor. They'll bring in anyone that would be interacting with the child on a regular basis to serve on this child study team. And the child study team is going to then provide additional support services and adapt the student's instructional program prior to initiating the formal assessment for eligibility. This step can be bypassed, and the team may choose to immediately seek the parental permission to go ahead and evaluate this child. Otherwise, the study team is just going to begin documenting. Every time they see something that looks somewhat suspicious for this child being able to function normally and regularly in the classroom, then these specialists, these other professionals in the building would just start documenting everything that they see this child do. And then there would be some evidence to validate testing the child. So then when they do take it to the parents can see that they've collected some evidence, so there must be something to it, so let's proceed. The school then seeks and receives the parents' permission, and it really and truly, it is much better if you can collect that evidence. I've seen this, and this occur, and I would just like to have some testing done just to see if there's if there are better ways that we can accommodate your child and educate your child. And parents usually are on board if there's enough evidence that's been collected, and if they see that your concern is for the best education possible for that child, rather than you're trying to discriminate against this child, or you're trying to bring up some negative aspects about their child. So you have to treat this with great caution. Phase 2 then leads into the assessment of the student's eligibility and the educational need. And this again is where the multidisciplinary and the non-discriminatory assessment tools come into play. And certain strategies are used to evaluate the student's eligibility. The child study team is going to, of course, assess the information and determine whether the student meets the eligibility requirements for special ed services or not. If a team agrees that the student is eligible for and this student needs special education services, then the process is going to move into phase 3, which is developing the individualized education program, the IEP. And this is where the team is going to meet, the appropriate professionals serve on this IEP team, and the team coordinator is appointed, the parents, and even the student. I have had and sat in and participated in many IEP developmental plans with the students sitting right there. And now remember, I was in high school for the most part of my teaching, but I have had junior high and middle school level children sitting in on these IEP meetings, because the child knows and the child understands, and he does much better if he's a part of the planning process. The team meets and the team agrees upon the essential elements that are going to be placed on the IEP for this child. You must also, if you're on this team, document and indicate the measurable annual goals that you're going to be looking for, the skills that are needing special education services, who are the people responsible for providing these services. For example, if the child just has an attention deficit disorder, it might be that this child needs to be pulled aside when he's doing specific tasks, or he may need to be pulled away from the rest of the students so that he can work kind of in an isolated area so he can get his focus when he's testing. He needs no distractions. And it might be that he would just go to a particular place in the classroom. Or some children, they go out of the classroom into a private room, and a resource or a parapro will then administer the test for that child, because the child, you're accommodating that child with ADD by removing all the distractions that would keep him from doing extremely well on the exam. The criteria and the evaluation procedures are also on there as to how this progress is going to be assessed along the way. The student's access to general education curriculum, in other words, how much access is the student going to have to the general educational curriculum in the regular classroom. The student's participation in the statewide and school district assessments. Many of the students with an IEP are going to have special accommodations when it comes to the testing, the end of year testing, the ACT Aspire testing materials. There will always be posted a beginning and end date for the special education services. Typically those are done yearly, and they begin in August School begins August 16 and ends May 11. Okay, so there's always the beginning and the ending dates. It is sometimes advisable to estimate that as a professional team, we believe that within 3 years this child will overcome this disability and be able to function normally. So you may even include that beginning and ending date. We're going to begin in grade 2 in August of his second grade year, and by the time he gets to the 5th grade, the accommodations will be alleviated. We will be assessing every year, and our goal is that every year we will be removing more and more until we get to the point where no accommodations are needed. The positive behavior interventions are also going to be placed on there. The student is going to be positively rewarded for his behavior efforts. So once the phase 3, the IEP, has been completely developed, you then slide into phase 4. You have to determine as a team the least restrictive environment, the LRE. You have to identify the potential educational placement based on the student's annual goals and the special education services that are going to be provided for that child. So you have to take that into consideration. What are the goals that we're trying to attain with this child and his special education services, and what exactly are those special education services that will be provided? Where's the best place to provide those? You have to adhere to the principle that students with disabilities are to be educated with their peers who do not have disabilities to the maximum extent that's appropriate. And then you have to justify any removal of that child from the general regular classroom. So if you say on his IEP that this child is going to be removed from the classroom for any period of time, you have to justify why are you removing that child from the classroom? Why are you not accommodating him right there in the classroom? So it's like I mentioned earlier, if the child has ADD and he cannot function and he cannot focus, especially on a test, if there are distractions in the classroom, and some students, a distraction is nothing more than a student who sits beside him who moves his hand, not being disruptive or anything, but just any bodily movements from the classroom. The child will become distracted. He will see an arm move, and then he will lose his focus and start focusing on, oh, he just moved his arm. So you have to be able to justify, and you have to make sure that you state it in such a way that so that this child can function at his best educational abilities. He will be removed from the classroom during testing time only. You have to be very careful with that too, because okay, so we said earlier the child is going to be labeled, but he can't be called a label. So you have to be very careful. It's like a fine line between what you're required to do and then what you're allowed to say and do. So if the child feels discriminated against by being sent out of the classroom to take an exam, then you have to find some way to accommodate that child within the classroom without making him feel as though you're discriminating against him according to what the other children are doing. You have to also have the parents completely involved in all the decision-making processes for the IEP of this child and where his services will be administered. You have to document on the student's IEP the justification for any removal from the general classroom. Every time you send that child out, you have to document it. I always kept a hard copy grade book. Even if it was on the computer, I would print out those grade sheets, and I would write in, for this test, the child went here, and I dated it. I kept thorough documentation because you never know. And there were times that administrators would come to me and say, I've got a parent who's questioning all of the teachers to make sure all of the teachers are accommodating their child. Do you have documentation proving that you are? And I would just make copies and say, this is coming from my grade book. Here's my documentation. So I promise you, if you've got documentation, you're going to be safe. You cannot have too much documentation either. I mean, document. That's major. Also, the team members must agree in writing to the essential elements of the IEP. There is a place on the IEP form that when you decide where will this child be placed in order to receive these special ed services, everybody has to agree to it. Everybody on that professional team, including the parents, and if the child is in the meeting, the child is participating in the meeting, the child has to sign it also. It has to be signed and dated. You never set up any kind of accommodation with a parent over the phone. The parent has to be there in person to sign it. Okay, so keep that in mind too. That will get you in very serious trouble, because if it's done over the phone, the parent could easily say, hey, my signature's not there. They did not consult me. And it's your word against theirs. So never do it over the phone. It has to be in person so that everybody can sign and date it at that meeting, that this is what we agreed upon. As members of the IEP team, parents must consent in writing to the agreed upon educational placement for that child. Phase 2 has to do with the assessing eligibility, and I want to point out one more thing about phase 2. Once the parent gives written consent to evaluate the child, the school child study team has to move forward with the assessment to determine the child's eligibility for those special education services. I think I've already thoroughly discussed phase 3, but just keep in mind, document the student's present level of performance and then agree upon the measurable goals and objectives, and then identify the skill areas that need the special ed. It may not be everything, but if he has to have special education services for PE or any other related school responsible service, you've got to have documentation on it. So PE is sometimes forgotten about, but you can't even forget PE or art. Document the student's access to the general curriculum. The student is staying in the regular classroom for all subject areas. He will only exit the room for testing purposes. And then again, document the student's participation when you're doing the state and district assessments, such as end of level, end of quarter, ACT Aspire, whatever the assessment. Document that he went here for these special accommodations. Establish beginning and end dates. I've already talked about that. And determine the process for reporting to the parents on the student's progress. Some teachers do every week. Some teachers, will catch it every 3 weeks. I would not wait until 9-week report cards go out to send your report on how this student is progressing. I would do at least every 2 weeks or 3 weeks at the most, to let them know that he is making progress. Phase 4, here's just a couple of more points I'm going to bring up about phase 4, where you determine the LRE. The decision is based on these 2 questions. What is the appropriate placement for this student given his annual goals? And which of the placement alternatives under consideration is consistent with the least restrictive environment? You always want to consider least restrictive. Okay, here is the chart regarding the referral process. This is a chart that if you want to stop the video and take a screenshot of this and save it, I downloaded this from the ADE site in the special education unit on the ADE site, the referral process. This is something, this little chart is just a good tool to have, maybe keep it in your grade book or keep it somewhere where it's easily accessible. Take a snapshot of it, print it out, and laminate it and put it right inside your desk drawer so that if you need to pull it out very quickly, you can kind of review and go through the steps in your mind very quickly. I've also provided for you the IEP. Now, the IEP form that's in the textbook is the old one. I will be evaluating this textbook this semester and probably changing textbooks next year, next fall. It takes that long of a process to go through this. But the IEP form that's in this year's textbook is outdated. They changed the IEPs last year. ADE did, and so I have included for you the website that has a printable PDF version of the new IEP form, and I'll have that also posted later in our classroom assignments. So just be aware that there is a new IEP form that is different from what's in the textbook. This chart just breaks down the purposes and the provisions of IDEA and the Section 504 ADA. The general purpose of IDEA provides the financial aid to states in their efforts to ensure the adequate and appropriate services for children and youth with disabilities. The definition of disability, of course, identifies 12 categories of disability conditions. However, the law also allows states and school districts the option of eliminating categories for children ages 3 through 9 and defining them as developmentally delayed. Now, I did not say that they eliminate them for the younger children ages birth to 2, but they can eliminate the category, and instead of calling them disabled, they can define them as being developmentally delayed. Okay, so that's the difference there. The responsibility of IDEA is to provide free and appropriate public education according to FAPE, and both statutes, the IDEA and the Section 504 ADA, require the provision of free and appropriate public education, including individually designed instruction to students covered under specific eligibility criteria. And almost anything falls in that eligibility criteria. IDEA requires that a student has a written IEP document. Now, let's look at the Section 504. The ADA, Section 504, prevents discrimination on the basis of a disability in the employment, programs, and services provided by the state and local governments, goods and services provided by private companies, and commercial facilities. So ADA 504 in a school district prevents any kind of discrimination for the disabled and the services that are provided to them. And ADA prevents discrimination and requires services being provided for adults in the workplace and in public facilities. Maybe they're not working there, they're just visiting. So, you see a lot of businesses that have the handicapped railing. They have the handicapped restroom stalls in all of the public places now. The Section 504 in the ADA definition of disability identifies students as disabled if they meet the definition of a qualified handicap person. For example, if a student has or has had a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activity, or if a student is regarded disabled by another. I have had students who played football and they end up with a concussion. We have to do a temporary 504 on them in that we make special accommodations while they are under the care of the doctor for this concussion. Same thing for, if they have a leg injury or an arm injury, and they're under the care of the doctor. They cannot take their test because this is the hand they write with, so their test has to be read to them, and or not necessarily the test is read to them, but they give their answers verbally to someone else who writes down their answers, and this would be done by a parapro. They can read their own test, they can't write because their arm is broken or injured. So those kinds of accommodations are also temporarily made, these according to 504 and ADA. The Section 504 does not require a written IEP document, but it does require a written plan, and we kind of refer to those as 504 accommodations. Okay, so you're going to hear that term when you get to be a classroom teacher. These are the 504 accommodation plans. Okay, No Child Left Behind was implemented many years ago. This was so that all students will be educated fairly and appropriately without leaving any child behind, regardless of what that child's disabilities might be. It had three main points. The focus on the student achievement was the primary measure of the school's success. It had emphasis on challenging academic standards that specify the knowledge and skills that students should acquire and the levels at which they should demonstrate these skills as they are getting ready to go to college or enter the workforce. And then the third point is the desire to extend the standards to all students, including those for whom the expectations have been traditionally low. So it used to be years ago, students with disabilities were just expected to score low and to be very behind academically. That went out the window with the No Child Left Behind. Now, No Child Left Behind was in place all the way through 2010, and after 2010, or as of 2010, it was replaced with what is called ESA. Okay, so I've given you the website, two different website links, and I would like for you to click on those two websites and go in and do some review on ESA. Every Student Succeeds Act is what ESA stands for. So, No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act. So, I don't know. ESA kind of has a bit of more of a positive connotation to it as opposed to No Child Left Behind. Every Student Succeeds Act. But go to those two websites and check that out. And ESA is basically No Child Left Behind with just a few revisions and updates, but nothing major. Okay, this concludes my lecture on Chapter 2. I hope you have found this enlightening and even helpful as you are studying and preparing for your exam. Please take some time and go through this video lecture, replay, whatever you have to do, stop and take notes. Please take this seriously because this is a very important chapter on accommodating all students appropriately. And again, remember, document, document, document to cover your tail. Have a good day, and I hope you do very well on this exam. 504 continued, and I'm not going to read all of this to you, but please take some time in this portion of your textbook going through the section 504 because you need to understand, how the funding works. You need to understand that it is the school's responsibility. Even if the school doesn't have the funding, the school has to find the means to provide the services somehow. They have to be able to pay for it. And I remember several years ago when I was teaching in the public school, I had a student who was deaf, and he had gone in for many surgeries and so on and so forth. And his parents insisted that our school, all of his classroom instructors would use a microphone, and we all had microphones that went around our necks. And then as the student got older and resources kind of advanced, the parents came back and insisted that now all the teachers use the Dragon, which was a method of the projector screen is open, the Dragon connects with our computer. I wore a microphone and I spoke into that microphone, and everything I said, the computer typed it and it was projected on the screen, so that when I am giving lecture notes, the student is actually reading the lecture notes. Now, let me tell you a tip about that. That year, I had that student for 3 years in high school for this, and I remember when we first got this system, there were glitches, there were bugs, and the computer, the system was recording and typing up words that I was not saying, and some of those words I would never even use those words, much less in using them in a classroom in front of a room full of students, high school students at that. But I finally decided that the best way for me to make this work for this student is that I would type all of my lecture notes prior to giving my lectures in those classes. And I lectured every day because it was literature. So I remember typing up all of my notes, and then I would pretty much go through my notes. And now the student could read my lips. So I was always very cautious to stand in such a way that he could see me when I'm talking. And if I deviated just slightly, because every once in a while I would throw something else in, or something would come up on the floor and I would address it and it's not in my notes, so I would make sure that I was facing him. I also had someone else in the classroom that was taking notes, if there was any additional notes other than what was printed on the screen. And I even went a step further with this student. I printed out my notes and sent those to his mother, so that whatever I lectured about in the classroom during the day, she had my exact set of notes and she could go over that with him at night at home. So it's very important that you accommodate you. And I documented that I sent these notes home to this parent today. I sent them, sometimes I did it weekly, and I would just send the whole week's note. If I was that good, if I was that much ahead, I could do that. But I at least sent them daily, and I documented that I sent the notes so that and nothing ever came up. Those parents, we had a good working relationship. I loved them. They loved me. We got along great. But if anything ever came up, I had documentation proving that I had done it. So go through this. The due process has to do with the child's rights to being heard and the parents' rights to a hearing. And there were many times that parents would call meetings, and they would call the administrator. Sometimes they would call the superintendent and say, I want a special meeting because my child's needs are not being met. And that's a big deal. So due process of hearing, if they ever take it before the school board, you know that you've really hit maximum level of not meeting their needs. But again, if you've met the needs, maybe other instructors are not, but you have, and you've got your documentation proving it, you're safe when that student or that parent requests that special hearing. The IEP must also include an explanation of the extent to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular classroom. It must also include a statement of any individual appropriate accommodations that are necessary to measure the academic achievement and functional performance of the child on state and district-wide assessments.